Hello and welcome to another episode of How to Be a Great GM. Yes, I have shaved, you may have noticed, but it was for a good cause. Basically, I'm having a head cast made, and I might pop up some of the pictures of the process, because it was quite a process, particularly the shaving part. Anyway, I digress. Today we are talking about naming and how to name things in your campaign. Now, it doesn't really matter whether you are running a sci-fi campaign or whether you are running a fantasy campaign or anywhere in between. Naming is vitally important, and yet so many of us, as we get down to write the name of the castle, the lord, the mystical device, the electronic device, the fusion reactor, we draw a blank. Now, there are lots of name generators out there, and there are lots of tables where you can randomly roll to come up with names and things, and that's all very good and well, but ultimately we want to get to the point where we as the game master are deciding exactly how our characters are named, and we're not just doing it by random chance. We're doing it with some kind of thought process. So when we look at how to name something, before we even start at the basic process, we need to understand what is the function of the name. Because names have three things. They have function, they have history, and they have personality. Now, if you look at your own name, for example, your own name might give you some clues to the history of the name. It might give you some clues to the function, or it might very well give you some clue to the personality. And we all have different associations with different names in our head. If I were to say Brian to you, well, you might conjure up any number of different personalities associated with the name Brian. You might have a history associated with someone named Brian. You might be a Brian. In which case, do you think that Brian really describes your personality? My name, for example, has a whole bunch of weird little bits and pieces into it if you look into the past. The first one being that it is also a generic term for a man or a group of men. Hey, guys, there's a bunch of guys, this is a guy, stop doing that, guy, etc., etc. But if you look at the history of my name, it was because some daft relative somewhere in the past decided that everybody in my family should have the letter Y in their first name. Now, you might think it's a folly, but if you look at the generation that I was born in, we've got Guy, we've got Holly, we've got Brian with a Y, we've got Daryl, we've got Stacy, Amy, Bronwyn with a Y, obviously. So our family had to come up with a lot of names that had lots of Ys in them, and you'd be surprised at just how many there are. So there's a bit of history there. Now, how does that help us in terms of role-playing? Well, and in terms of creating a name, in terms of role-playing. That little bit of history is not necessarily valuable unless you associate it with a character who has also got a Y in their name, and you run that throughout their entire family. The players will pick up on it. So let's go back. Let's put on the brakes. When we look at the components that make up a good name, let's look at function. So function is all about describing what it does. Now, this is a great place to start, and oftentimes in science fiction we use function to really change up how we describe ordinary things to make them sound absolutely fantastic, like a flux capacitor inverter. None of those are fantastical names. Flux is an existing thing, capacitor is an existing thing, and inverter is something that we use all over the place to change power from one form to another. But a flux capacitor inverter now suddenly sounds amazing. But we're just using words to describe a function, whether that function is real or, in this case, make-believe. So function tells us what it does. It might tell us why it does it. So if we look at something, again I'm going to draw from Star Trek here, if we look at the module called the Heisenberg compensator. Now the Heisenberg compensator sits in the teleportation device of the starship, and basically they came up with the name Heisenberg compensator because and here's the short answer, in quantum mechanics, you can never tell exactly where a particle is or how fast it's moving at the same time. You can do one or the other. Heisenberg, who was this weird and wonderful scientist, said this is a law, and so you can never actually determine both of them at the same time. Star Trek's transporters need it to happen, so you basically then have this device called the Heisenberg compensator. It compensates for his rules that say you can't know both at the same time. Pure function, and yet it sounds pretty cool, right? So it tells us why it does something, and function can also tell us who can use it. The gnomish wand of levitation. Well, now we know it's gnomish, and so gnomes can probably use it. It is a wand, and it causes levitation. So all of that just out of its function. And it sounds, again, like a fairly cool device. I would like 3 wands of gnomish levitation, please. So function certainly allows us to work around and come up with some pretty cool names without having to stretch our imaginations too far. We're literally describing something. Another function that a name can have is it can bring in history. So if we were to say Churchill's ballpoint pen of scribing, well, there's now a whole bunch of history that's been brought into this ballpoint pen. In fantasy, of course, sometimes it's a bit tricky because players don't know the history of that world as well as they know our own, or don't in the case of some players. So you might need to say, well, this is Sangordrax's sword of slaying, and have the characters make a roll and go, well, Sangordrax was this amazing warrior 400 years ago who was famous for slaying dragons. Now this sword, we know, should probably have some properties against dragons. So by building in a bit of a history component, still describing its function, but putting in some history, this suddenly makes it more alive. You can look at who made it. The Ancient Elder's Staff of Summoning. Well, there's a whole bunch of history. We know what it does. We know where it comes from. So history can be really valuable. It could also help describe what it's done. So troll slaying, the ancient troll slaying axe from the battlefields of Kalandan, and all of that history just builds up stuff. Obviously, I'm trying to make things up on the fly. You've got the advantage of being able to sit down and put a little bit more thought into it. But by simply putting down that name, suddenly we've got the battlefield of Kalandan, we've got ancient dwarves. What were they fighting? Who were they fighting? Why were they fighting? All from this one little process of creating a name for a magical item that the characters are going to pick up. If we move from history, we can then talk to personality. What is the personality of this item? Now, it could tell us the attitude. So, Angry Mince's sword of cleaving. Well, now the weapon is probably a violent weapon. If it's Angry Mince's, whoever Angry Mince is, it could tell us its alignment. The Dark Sword of Doom, giving us alignment. Simply by giving it some personality, using descriptors, whether they're emotions or tones or feelings, it suddenly creates this really cool name. And then it can also give us a promise. So the magnificent sword of heroic slaying. Wow, that gives us a promise that we will be heroic if we slay this weapon. Almost all alcohol and cigarette adverts in the 90s were a promise of sex based on smoking a cigarette. That, of course, is now subsequently changed. Now, with alcohol, usually it's a promise of having lots of friends around you who want to sponge off of those free drinks that you keep giving out. So that encompasses, in very broad strokes, the differences between function, history, and personality, and how you can use those to really create some really cool names. But I haven't really got to how you create fantasy names. Now, for that, it's a whole different ballgame, and it's a lot easier than you might think. So where do we start? Well, let's look at how do we combine words together to create a name, and I've been doing that throughout the previous section of this video, is putting things together. So let's take the example divine grace. So we could put divine grace almost in front of anything. A missile of divine grace, the divine grace torpedo, the bow of divine grace, the divine grace sword or lance, or whatever the case might be. It could even be the name of someone. All hail divine grace Anastasia. Again, it is simply putting together two words, divine grace, flaming light, dull wooden, or whatever the case might be. I think you get the idea. So combinations allow us to bring two different words together that will really help describe its function, its history, or its personality, or the person's personality, to give us a sense of what this thing is. We can do, and this is one of my favorites because it's really quick to do and it gives you some really different names, a vowel swap. So wherever you have an A, put in an I. Wherever you have an E, put in an O. So if you think of your own name, take all your vowels out and replace them with different vowels. And suddenly you have a very different sounding name. If we take Divine Grace, for example, and we replace the I's with A's and O's and I's, and the E with an I, and the I with an O, and the O with an E, you get Divoni Griasso. It's the same thing, but Divoni Griasso is now something very different. All pay homage to Divoni Griasso. Now suddenly it's this new title. It's still Divine Grace, but now it's Divoni Grasso. Or pick any other combination you might like. Even with your own name, if you're dropping out vowels and things, with my name there's a certain letter that can go in there which might be accurate, but which doesn't make for a very good name. But I could put in an I and become Guy, or I could put in an O and become Goy. It's a different name, and all I've done is replace the vowels. So vowel swapping is very easy. John becomes Jin or Jen. You get the idea. Adjectives. Adjectives, and I've used them earlier, adjectives are really easy things to do to add in some kind of function or history or personality. Flaming divine grace, or divine flaming grace, or lightning divine grace, or dark divine grace. Adjectives just help us to combine things. It is a combination, but not of two words, but now of multiple words. So adjectives are a great way to build up a name. Then compounds. You take some letters from one word, some letters from another, and you get the divi grace, or the divi grace, if you want to change how you're pronouncing it. But by gluing two words together and dropping out a whole bunch of letters, you suddenly create a new name, and it's really quick to do. This is the important thing, is that you don't want your players to say, hey, I talked to that random NPC over there. Random NPC, what's your name? And you're going, I'm going to call him the Flaming Grace of Turtles, Brian. Just call him Breen. You speak to Breen. Hi, I'm Breen. How are you doing? Whatever the case might be. So this is about how we can quickly come up with different ways of creating names. So compounds are quite fun to do. You could do collectives. So it is the divine grace of light, the divine grace of the seven heavens. And this is where you can really have fun and really make your players engage. So a very good example is when you're coming up with names for unusual things, like in one of the campaigns I'm running, we needed to have the name of a water elemental. What do you call a water elemental? Whoosh, swoosh, splash, wave, froth. None of those are really exciting. But if you call him breaks on rocks and devours them, and he will not respond to the players unless they say, breaks on rocks and then devours them, please answer our call. Then he will turn and respond. Breaks on rocks, it's all function, and then devours them, personality, gives us a whole idea that this is a water elemental who's really about waves and crashing against rocks and being violent and dominant and not giving in. So a nice collective name was put together to describe his function and his history and his personality. Then you can racialize the name. So when you look at different races, you go, all right, well, what would divine grace be in a Latin-like language? Divinatus graci, perhaps. Divinatus graci. If we were Dwarvish, divinax gracium. Divine grace, but now there's an X in there and then an at the end to make it sound a little bit more Dwarvish. This is the divinax gracium. All pay homage. The great warhammer of divinax gracium shall be yours. Whatever the case might be. And you can change it around. Divindax grach, to make it sound more guttural. The divinax grach must be retrieved. However you do it, it's about deciding what are certain tones within the language that you want to convey, and then just gluing it onto the word. Maybe dropping a vowel or a consonant here or there, just to shift it up. And then finally, you can add in a prefix or a suffix. So the pro divinati graciatum. Pro divinati graciatum. So we're adding pro and we're adding artum at the end. So it really does change it. So with that combination, we have divine grace, divoni greaco, flaming divine grace, divi grace, divine grace of light, divinatus graci, divinax gracium, divindax grach, and pro divani gracium. Quite a lot of different names out of one little combination of letters. So now you really shouldn't have any excuse as to why you can't come up with names. It's about just playing around with those different options, looking at function, looking at history, looking at personality, and then looking at how can you combine, vowel swap, add some adjectives, compound words together, use collectives, change it slightly to be different for the race, or add a prefix or a suffix, and suddenly you have this world of names at your fingertips. I hope this helps, and let us know what you think of the new look. I'm fairly certain the audio is going to be bad because I haven't soundproofed this room yet, but until next time, hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, and happy gaming.